What's up, YouTube? Happy New Year 2022. And thank you to all of those who have contacted me personally or through the comments below and asking me what's happening, where am I, and what's going on. I appreciate that. That sort of gives me the sort of encouragement to come back and do these videos more. So I'm sort of back. Just a short story. I had moved homes. So I'm now into a new home. You can see some of my changed backgrounds here. I'm still not done moving in yet. But anyway, that's sort of basically what sort of sent me off my trajectory. I'm trying to get back this year. So this is the first of that effort of kind of getting back into my regular groove of making videos. So here we are. So what is this video about? It's essentially about logging or config provider / logging in a non-ASP.NET application. I'm calling it console application sort of generically. It applies to anything that is not ASP.NET based. Okay, so it could be a console application, it could be a background service, it could be an Azure function application, a Windows service application, and so on and on and on. The reason I'm saying that is that both of these things, configuration, especially logging, it seems like it's somehow coupled to dependency injection, and that's sort of available to you out of the box in ASP.NET. And so it sort of happens magically in ASP.NET logging. And then when you want to apply the same techniques for your other applications, then it's like a mystery, right? And since I don't use dependency injection, this mystery had to be solved many years ago. Or through every .NET version, essentially, .NET Core version. And things have changed over and over. So this is .NET 5, but I think the same ideas or concepts would apply for, let's say, .NET Core 3.1, all right? Now, so not only is getting logging correctly sort of enabled and configuration provider enabled in a console application, again, console application, meaning generally the non-ASP.NET application, functioning correctly, getting app insights is a whole nother bear of a problem. And so I thought I'd sort of combine these two things together. So this video, the source code that I have in the link below, it gives you the sort of the solution to the problem. If you want, that's all you want, the solution, get the source code. You don't need to watch the rest of the video. I'm not necessarily going to explain the source code. What I do want to talk about is logging in general. Some of the issues that I see, in my experiences, that problems that people have when they do the logging, and some of the issues that come from that, and some of the issues with just the logging infrastructure in .NET, and what to do about that or how to circumvent those issues. All right. So if you just want to know how to get this logging working, look at the source code. There's this one class. Let me show you the class before you run off. Look at it. It's the LoggerProvider, right? This class is sort of standalone class. It requires just a couple of arguments here to help it get the logging information. Basically, it's like a delegate that gives it an I configuration. The I configuration is essentially as part of your config file. It needs this portion, the logging portion, right? That's all it is. And once you give it this logging portion, the LoggerProvider will configure your logger as per that section. All right. The rest of it looks fairly similar. I've got some comments here where relevant. So in this case, the logger is configured to log debug logs, console log, event source log, and app insights log and event logs, Windows event logs. Right. So I've set this up. You can of course modify this the way you need it. And essentially it's got one method called create logger, and that's that. Right. So the log name, rather than just making this generic and every place in your application having to specify some generic thing, the problem with that is, at least for me, they come under different, what they call category names. And then your entire application seems to be divided across different category names. And what if you just want it in one bucket, right? So that's the reason I don't rely on the category name part or the generic type argument. I just rather have a create logger. The name you provided up front here in the constructor, the event, what's seen as event log here, becomes the category name, if you will. Right? So once you have this thing in your application, that's what it is. Okay. So for those who just want to know how it's done, use this application logging provider, and you're off the races. The class is a production-ready class, so you can use it in production if that's what you want. All right. The rest of the code, as in the program CS code that I'm going to show you here, this code is not production ready. This is just for demo purposes. It's simply to show you the different permutations, if you will, that you might see in your code. So please don't regard this code that you see here as something that's production ready. It's not. It's using that one class that's production ready, and that's it. All right. Okay. So before we go on to App Insights, now some people might say, oh, but App Insights just doesn't apply to me. Maybe not, but maybe it does. So let me spend some time just explaining to you what App Insights is and how you may benefit from it. Application Insights is I think it's a feature of Azure Monitor. So it's sort of a subset of Azure Monitor. And with Azure Application Insights, you don't need to have your applications running in Azure. Okay, so your applications can be running anywhere, on premises, on your local machine, anywhere in the world, basically. It doesn't have to be in Azure, all right? And they can be cross-platform applications, meaning .NET, Java, Python, what else? Node.js, right? So if your applications are written across different sort of programming platforms and they're hosted in-house, on premises, or with another hosting provider, you can still use App Insights and have all these applications send their data to this one location, like this one repository, if you will. And App Insights also makes it very, very simple to capture performance counters, and there is a whole host of other telemetry, such as the number of requests your application has received, the response times, when you make dependency calls, how much time do those things take? How often are you making calls to those dependencies? And you can correlate saying this input, this request came in here, and that output or that request to some dependencies were correlated to this input, and so on and so forth. So this is a huge stuff. So there's a whole host of features available to you within App Insights, and reporting, dashboarding, alerting, based on certain criteria and things. So there's quite a bit there. I think the benefit or the big thing is your apps don't have to be hosted in Azure, and it's quite cheap. I think it's, let's assume it's $3 under per GB, under $3 per GB, right? And it then becomes cheaper. That is pay as you go. But if you commit to, I don't know, let's say, 10 GB or 100 GB per month, then you're not actually paying, you're paying less than that, under $3 per GB. Maybe it's $2 per GB or something, right? So take a look at it. Either ways, even if it's your just personal account to try it, I think it's super useful, considering it's so easy and it fits perfectly into this, the ILogger feature in .NET Core, including the telemetry, which happens automatically, especially in ASP.NET applications. And you can do the same in your application. Now, I'm not talking about telemetry today. You can enable telemetry since it's just part of the logging kind of feature, but I'm only talking about App Insights and your logs, meaning the things that you would intentionally log, you can log information or log warning, error, and so on. All right? Okay. So let's look at the program CS, and I'll give you some explanation here. We'll run the code. I'll show you what it looks like. And then we'll discuss some of my guidances and some of the problems. So the rest of this video is going to be kind of showing you what this code does. So if in case you want to start using it and you want to know what it does before you look at the code and examine it, then that's what it is. Then I'll talk to you about some of the problems I feel logging generally has. Nothing with ASP.NET or .NET, just logging. And then in specific to the problems with the ILogger interface and such. All right. And there's chapter markers on the timeline below. So if you want to just skip ahead, feel free to do that. All right. Okay. So this program CS is fairly simple. Just assume that this code here is not, of course, in your method, if you will, if you were in some sort of a method of your application, assuming that you already have an instance of a logger. All right. So now you have an instance of a logger in this class. You want to use it, and you're in a method, and that's sort of the entry point of the method. All right. Oh, that is. So now I use an enum here. So in some ways, I am suggesting that you use an enum of sorts that tells you the stage or step, if you will, that you're in your app, in your methods. That becomes handy in some cases, even when okay, let me back up. I log only exceptions in my application. I don't log anything else. But even then, when I get an exception, I want to know at what stage, what step, or what step sequence did that exception occur. So I do use the enums. I just don't log in every step. That way, when I do get an exception, I'll say, okay, so it went through step 1, step 2, step 3. It's saying it's in step 3 and an exception occurred, which means it never got to step 4. So the exception occurred in step 3, right? So you get to know, or you understand how that, or when, or what stage that happened. So I do suggest using some sort of an enum in complicated sequences. If you have a method that has many, many steps in there, then you have the first one, then you have some names that you give it. I'm just giving it generically step 1, step 2. This should be meaningful to you. And over here, you're doing this or setting this value before actually doing the work. All right. So before actually attempting to do the step 1 in this case, you first set the enum to that value, and then you do step 1. I'm just logging it here. And then before doing step 2, you set the enum value to step 2, then do step 2. I simply, again, just logging it here. So you would probably log it before or after the step and so on. But I'm not doing the actual work here, simply just logging. All right. So I'm going to run this application and show you what all happens through the logger provider that you have access to in the source code. And then we'll have a deeper discussion. Right. Now, keep note here also that I've commented this or kept this throw exception commented out. In other words, there will be no exception here. So it's going to log a debug log. It's going to log a log informational log and a warning log. But it won't be logging the exceptions since no exception actually occurs here. Right. So I'm going to run this application. Now it takes about, you can see on the console also, there's some logs that occurred there. And that's the same logging you see over here. The 3 different types of logs, the debug, warning, and information. Now it takes about 2 to 3 minutes for the logs that you had here to appear in App Insights, but we look at the Windows event logs to see those events here. Event viewer. Now in the logger provider, I put some comments here for the logs. You need to create your event viewer log. So I give you the instructions for how to do that using PowerShell. So you would need to create that first. And I'm just going to simply go and expand. It's under a log name called YouTube logs, I believe. There. And I see these 3 logs here. Right? You don't see the debug, but you see the warning and information. And if you were to look at some of the data here, the category is YouTube logs. That's, in some places, it will be called category name. Here it's being called category. Event ID is the event ID in the code. So that event ID, the category is the name of the logger, if you will. Right? This name that I sent here, that's the category name. So that's what you're seeing here, YouTube.logs. And then the message. You can go into the details and look at the friendly version, and you can see that there. Same for the warning. You'll see the friendly version, but also in the general version, you'll see all this information. So this is all your information you set up. It's available here. Let's go look at the App Insights. All right. So in the App Insights, I'm just going to go here to the full transaction search and set it for the last 30 minutes. And you should see at least those 3 logs here. All right. So there are a few buckets here. Let me also just explain that in App Insights because this becomes a bit important. Okay. So these are what I'm calling them buckets. Think of them as different repositories for data. And all of the warning information, and this is debug, they call it verbose here, all end up in your traces bucket. Exceptions, if logged correctly, will appear in the exceptions bucket. And that's one of the issues I have with the ILogger infrastructure, where you got to be really critical, really careful about logging exceptions correctly. Otherwise, they won't end up there in that bucket, in the exceptions bucket. When we have the exceptions turned on, you'll see that an exception will end up in this bucket. The page views, requests, availability, at least page view requests only apply to ASP.NET applications. We'll talk about custom events in probably another video, depending on if there's a requirement or demand for that. Custom events, it uses a different infrastructure, telemetry client, and you need to define custom events. I think it's fairly useful. It just doesn't fit into the Logger or the ILogger infrastructure in .NET, so it's completely different. But if those who want to know, I could probably make a little short video on that. So, but that shows up over here. So only the telemetry, if you use the telemetry client, not the ILogger, can you create custom events, and then they would show up here. Okay, so you see the information here. When I click on one of these, let's say warning, I'll see the details, and let me zoom out. Okay, now if you can see here, let me zoom in here. You see the event ID. This is what we set up in our code. We are seeing it here as event ID. This is, even though it's under custom property, is sort of predefined by the .NET framework. Category name is also predefined by the .NET framework. The value, of course, we specified. So in both cases, we specified this value in our code, but the actual name has been predetermined by .NET. Execution step is our property. So you see how it's showing up under custom properties here. But we defined the property. I'll show you how we did that and the value to it. And then, and so when that's all we've done in this specific log, some of the other stuff here you see on the top, trace properties are, for the most part, all automatically determined by the framework, except our message is, of course, something we determined here. Right? This ID also is another property we defined, and the value we defined. So how do we define execution step and ID? Let's look at that. So if you look at this message here, it's just a string, or looks like a string, and it is just a string. It's not string interpolation, it's just a string. But the curlies here determine or denote the properties you're interested in. And then after the string message, the rest of the arguments are sort of one-to-one corresponding to the what you would call properties. All right, so because I call this property method name, and this is the first argument, it takes a method name as main, which is program.main. And when I look at the second, which is execution step, then that becomes the property name, and that becomes the value. And then this one is the ID, and that becomes the value. All right, so that's how you define property names. Now there's a problem here, of course, because it's all done by hand, and so maybe you call it method name in this case, and another place you mistyped method name to something else, and nobody's going to tell you there's a fault. Like the compiler is not going to check you and let you know that's a problem. So that is, you've got to be careful about that. That's going to cause you some trouble. In other words, when you do filters, you use the properties to filter, do reports, alerts, and things of that nature. And saying, when the method name is blah, then send me an alert. Well, if the method name property was mistyped, it's never going to equate, and now you don't get the alert. You see, so that becomes a problem, right? I'm going to just convert this over and throw an exception. And then we look at the exception scenarios as well. So I'll just run it for a bit. Now you'll see the failed exception. If you go back to our event logs, you'll see if I refresh this. We see the error, and of course from the previous one, we see the warning, right? And you get the full information again, the category, the event ID. Let me just zoom in case you can't read that. Our message, and of course in the details, we'll see the same thing here, right? So that's for the event logs. This is only applicable to Windows. It doesn't apply to Linux. And if you were go to App Insights, and so here's the exception, and it's arrived in been put in this bucket. Okay, so we look at the exception message details. Over here again, you'll see there are additional properties. Got the same category name. You've got event ID, but you also got the exception type, which is our property and our name and our property value. again, the execution step, and so on. So we have our client in the stack trace. It's all sort of available to us here. So that's pretty cool. Of course, as I said, you have to be very careful making sure you log exceptions correctly. So what does that mean? So now we're going to start on the next sort of chapter, which is the problems with logging, generally speaking, the guidances, if you will, that I would like to share with you with regards to logging, and then the problems with the .NET Core, ILogger, that whole framework, and then how to fix that or how to circumvent some of those issues, right? So to me, logging is as important as exceptions. And let me sort of paraphrase that a bit or establish the baseline for that. For me, exceptions are super important. I throw a lot of exceptions in my applications, but there is a high bar to throwing an exception, which is when I throw an exception, I have to provide whoever's going to receive this exception with enough information for them to understand the true nature of the problem. It can't just be some, stupid error message. Null reference exception. It's the classic. Give them as much information as possible for them to understand the true nature of the problem. Give them possible solutions. So let's say if there's a list of possible values and they send a value that's not within that list, then tell them what those values are. If it's like an enum or something. And any contextual information that will help them and or you reproduce the problem. So input arguments to the method and so on and so forth. So when I throw an exception in my application, it's super important to do that, because when I see an exception in my log, I need to be able to reproduce the problem. Right? So logging is the same, right? And then at the end of the day, when you're logging, you want to log all that information that you just captured in your exceptions. And if you're logging informational logs, then you need to hold yourself to the same bar. I believe you need to hold yourself to the same bar. If I'm going to log something, I need to know enough contextual information. Where am I? What am I trying to do? What does the world for me in that context look like? Values of various local variables and such. So that when I look at the logs and I'm trying to digest the log, that is going to help me understand what is happening in the system, right? That's why you're logging something in the first place, because you're not there. You don't have the debugger at your disposal, so you want to log. So then might as well log the information that is going to help you understand what's going on in your system. But there has to be a method to the madness, meaning there has to be consistency in your logs, because that's going to help you query, pull reports, dashboards, and such like. I see a lot of times people are just logging stuff to kind of get the job done. The same with exceptions, by the way. It's not any different. But with exceptions, I've got like one try catch. In my exceptions, I'm logging that place in one place, but I throw exceptions in many places in my system. So I have to be careful at that point, right? If I don't throw the right information put the right information in my exceptions, they won't appear in the logs. If you're logging informational and other kinds of things in your application, then you are doing much more work that needs to be carefully scrutinized, if you will, right? So I won't belabor the point. All I'm trying to say is logging. If you end up finding you need to do the logging, then don't just log for the sake of logging. There needs to be a method. There needs to be scrutiny around what are you logging, consistency around names of things. Like if I call this property method name, then it needs to be called method name everywhere in my system, not just here. If I call that execution step, it should be execution step everywhere in my system. If that's an idea, because it's very generic here, but let's say it means something to you, orchestration ID, let's say, then it should be the same across the system. So as a result, because there's no help from the framework, from the compiler, if you will, because the classes don't have that feature, it's up to you to ensure that within your applications, there is a certain sort of minimum standard that is being met when you log informational warnings, criticals, errors, and so on, especially now exceptions, right? So moving on to some of the problems with this logger thing. So I'm not recommending you log information warning. I don't like to do that. If I did do that during the early stages of a applications development, it'll be removed by the time it goes to production. All right. So, or maybe if it goes to production, it'll be removed soon after, like within the next month or so, because I don't like to leave the log informations and warnings around for two reasons. One is clutters the code. But the second problem is that there's a problem with performance in the application with the logger. So you got to be careful, especially in those cases where performance becomes critical. If your application is in a high performance environment where this certain method is being called many times a second, like thousands of times a second, that's going to be a problem with all these logs in your method. All right. So going back to, or now going to the problems with the logger versus the exceptions. All these methods are overloaded, which means I don't have to provide an exception as an argument here, in this case, the second argument to the log error. If I don't do that, then this log doesn't appear in the exception bucket. So even though you say log error, it doesn't actually appear in the exception bucket, and the log error doesn't require to provide an exception. I think that's super dangerous, especially in an application that you're writing. So I would suggest, and I'll give you a simple solution to these problems, that you have a separate class for your application that adapts to your application's requirements, which would mean if you're logging an error, you need to have an exception. Right? There's no way to log an error without an exception. There's no overload available to you that is without an exception. Right? Conversely, here, when I log information, if I were to provide an exception, which is also possible here, since the overloads are the same, then this log, even though it's log information, will actually become an exception. I just will go into that bucket. So beware of these things where if you plan to use your applications, the logs for filtering, reporting, alerting, and so on and so forth, which I think is sort of at the end of it, that's the culmination of all this work and all this video is to show you how to do that so that you can make use of it. Then it's like what they say, bad data, junk in, junk out, bad data in, bad data out, same thing, right? When you log, that's the data that's going into, let's say, your database. If you're not careful about sending the right kind of data to your database, pulling it back out, you're just going to get junk again. So what's the point? You're just wasting everyone's time, including yours, right? So that's the problem with that. Exception logging here or error logging, all right? And the overloads cause the problem. So the way to alleviate the problem with the overloads, and there's another issue here with these, even though these property names are pretty cool, is structured logging. They call it structured logging. Pretty cool idea to have curlies and then have arguments here. But the issue with this is, when you have too many of these log information, especially any of these other than log error in your code, is you get a false sense where you feel that because those logs don't appear, let's say if you've made a release build and you've changed your logging levels to error in your app settings file. So you don't see informational logs, you don't see warning logs, you don't see debug logs, thankfully. You get a sense of that, okay, so it's not logging. Yes, it's not logging. That doesn't mean it's coming for free though. You're still calling the methods. And calling these methods is expensive, and I'll explain why. So you're still paying the penalty for calling the methods. It's only after you've called a method that somewhere internal to the .NET framework is determining if it should be doing the logging. But you've already paid the price. What's that price? The price is that these arguments, especially the value types here, the enum and the integer here, to call these arguments, there's allocations going on, right? So this is not coming for free. So it's going to call the debug, and only inside of this method is it then going to say, okay, am I set up to the log level of debug? If not, then don't do anything in return, which means you paid the price for the call, and you paid the price for the call, and you paid the price for the call, and you paid the price for the call, yet you're not logging any of this stuff if you've set your logs to error only, right? So it sounds cool, it looks cool. If you like the clutter, I'm saying remove the clutter and be done with that. But if you need to leave the logs in place, I'll show you what you can do, not only for the exceptions, but also for your log warnings. All right. So in the same project, there is another class. I call it ApplicationLogger. Okay. This is an adapter over your logger. So it takes an ILogger in the constructor and uses the ILogger internally. And I've just shown examples of the log exceptions since I just do exceptions. Every method here asks for the event ID and an exception. So you have no way to log an exception without providing an exception, right? And then the other parameters are generic, so no boxing and unboxing occurs. To call this method is not expensive, as in you're not paying the price of garbage collection or allocations. And here we check to see if that log level is enabled, error level. And if it is, only then does it call the original log method. But again, this time is ensuring that the exception is being sent in there each time, right? So you kind of get the benefits of both. One is you have a more strongly typed method for your applications that can take, in this case for exceptions, can take 3, 4, or 5 arguments. We normally have 3 or 4. And they're generic, so they don't incur the cost of boxing and unboxing and other allocations, the params array. And then we just call that. Okay, so if you're not in that case of need for logging, then we don't log at all and we remove, go back from here. You can do the same for your log warnings and so on and so forth. Simply, adding more methods to this class. The way you would use this class then would be in your application. So let's say in program CS here, once I have this logger, I just say AppLogger is equal to new ApplicationLogger. And that I provided with our logger, right? And then instead of using logger, I just use AppLogger, let's say in the case of an exception, .log exception. And now here I see 3 overloads, but they all ask or require me to send in the exception type here, the exception instance here, right? All right, so you can use that class, the adapter class. You might need it specifically for different applications of yours. I'm calling it AppLogger, call it whatever you want. It doesn't care what logger or where you got the logger from. Just use the any ILogger, right? And it makes it strongly typed, and so that within your application, there's some consistency and some guarantees, if you will. If you're logging an exception, at least they'll all appear in the exception bucket because you are forcing people to provide you with an exception, right? And similarly, maybe for log information, there's no opportunity to provide an exception, so people can't make that mistake, right? So that way it works sort of backwards. Oh, sorry, one more thing. App Insights, you can also, I believe, there's a screen. Screen built in here into Visual Studio to look at your App Insights. So I could, for example, look at it for the last hour, maybe. And we should see our logs here. You see the same logs here. You have much more filtering capability over here. And sort of you can build a dashboard here as well. So anyway, I thought I'd just show you that because that's also pretty cool. You still need to have an Azure account and the key, as you can see, App Insights, the key. But once you set that up in your Visual Studio, it's already here, right? Okay. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give me a thumbs up and I'll see you next time.